Good afternoon. Today we have a speaker from the UK. Helen Bramah is a PhD candidate in the Department of Politics, Languages and International Studies at the University of Bath. Her research focuses on online information and political trust, with a particular interest in how citizens make judgments on trustworthiness. She brings with her 2 decades of experience in local government, where she dealt with politicians, media, and residents in a first-hand approach in her career as a specialist in communications. So Helen, we're very happy to have you as a speaker today. The topic of the talk of Helen is, as you can see on the screen, how to convey trustworthiness via social media. Helen made a content analysis and citizen testing of the Facebook post of British MPs, Member of Parliament, against the House of Commons. So the paper of Helen is about trust. The low and declining level of political trust in the UK is well documented, but less is known about how citizens form trust judgments and how politicians can influence perceptions of trustworthiness through social media. Her presentation today addresses important questions using a new combination of content analysis and survey research, operationalization, academic theory on political trust, within the context of Facebook communication through a new perspective, a new lens. Her findings offer a unique insight into how trustworthiness is conveyed on social media and the types of content which are displaying for the users competence, integrity, and authenticity. The perceptions of UK citizens of their members of parliament and this communication by MPs on Facebook are tested in an original survey using embedded Facebook content, allowing key features of high and low trust posts to be identified. We're very pleased to have Helen here, and I would like to give the floor to Helen. Please go ahead with your interesting lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks very much to the team for inviting me to present my research today. So the paper I'm going to present this afternoon was published in Parliamentary Affairs this January, and as you said in the introduction, it includes the findings of 2 studies that I carried out, looking at the way that British MPs are currently using Facebook to communicate with citizens, and how this might be helping to either build or diminish trust. So I'm going to start off by giving a bit of background about the current state of political trust, particularly in the UK, and why that matters. I'll briefly talk about why I chose to study Facebook communication in particular. Then I'll talk about each of the 2 studies in turn. At the end, I'll give you some practical do's and don'ts based on my research for what politicians might want to think about when using social media, particularly Facebook. And then finally talk about where I'm going next with my research. My presentation will probably last about half an hour. I'm happy to take any questions at the end of the presentation. So it's great to be part of a webinar series all about trust. I realise I probably don't need to spend much time setting the scene because it's what you're all working on. But I thought it might be useful to just start with some recent figures about the situation in the UK, which is where my research is focused. So on the screen, we've got a report from the Committee on Standards in Public Life, published in 2021. You can see, if you look at the bottom bar, the blue one, you can see that people really care about ethics. So 70% of people surveyed said that ethical standards are really important to them. You can also see that politicians are not living up to these expectations. Almost half of people in the UK don't think that politicians tell the truth. 2/3 say they're too easily influenced by the rich and powerful. This really matters because if politicians aren't trusted, it's harder for them to do their jobs. People are less likely to comply with policy measures, less likely to take in beneficial activities, less likely to pay tax. And it also makes it more difficult for the government to operate and to deal with long-term challenging issues like climate change, pandemics, or conflict. What's interesting is that this distrust is specific to MPs and not so much in other professions. So taking a look at, there's another graph here from YouGov, which is a survey of how people regard in terms of trust a whole range of professions. I've just picked out a few examples here. But among all the examples, MPs were right down there at the bottom with a net rating of minus 64 for trustworthiness. You can see how that compares to, say, family doctors who've got around a positive 70% rating. Even academics have got about a 45% rating. So really, MPs are in a very, very low position. And I mean, obviously, there have been like recent events such as the Partygate scandal. We've had a number of changes of prime minister that may have contributed to falling trust. But this survey was taken after the recent general election, so you might think that might have helped to boost trust a little bit. And yet MPs are still particularly low, only just almost matched by journalists. Local MPs are slightly higher than the government in general, but still very much in the negative. And I mean, my question really is, are politicians in general really that different from the kind of people that work in all those other professions? Very few MPs actually ever convicted of wrongdoing. Recent research by Smith and Newman in 2023 looked at what MPs were motivated by, and most claim that they were motivated by a desire to change the world or to do public service rather than for personal gain. But it's clear from these two examples that very few people in the UK really believe that is the case. So I'm sort of starting from maybe quite an optimistic standpoint that there are lots of trustworthy politicians out there. And what could they do to reassure people that they really are to be trusted? So I'm not trying to delude people that politicians are trustworthy that when they're not, but those that are trustworthy, how can they persuade people of that? So as a starting point, let's consider how people make judgments about trustworthiness. Again, I expect many of you are familiar already with this from the literature, that there's broad agreement that trustworthiness is a multidimensional construct made of at least 2 or 3 or more dimensions. So I think the first 2 dimensions are quite well agreed on. They've got, some people give them different names, but broadly they're either competence and integrity. So competence is about having the skills and abilities to do the job. In the case of an MP, this might be being good at making a speech, being able to represent their constituents, having good understanding of policy issues, and being able to deliver changes on issues that matter to people. The second dimension is integrity. So that's not so much about how politicians do the job, but more about not so much what they do, but how they do it. So that's about being fair, honest, telling the truth, acting by moral principles rather than for personal gain. And the research tends to suggest that integrity is the most important of all the different aspects. So there's less agreement on what the third or fourth dimensions might be, but quite recent research has highlighted the importance of authenticity. And it's been particularly related to social media communication, which is why I've chosen to include that in my framework for this research. Authenticity sort of had 2 sides to it. One is about the politician revealing their real self. And the other side is about being in touch with the needs of ordinary people. So sort of knowing what it's like to be a sort of real person and being able to represent those needs. So I've used these 3 dimensions as a framework for both studies. And I'm focusing on how do politicians communicate these or not when they're posting on Facebook. So why Facebook, you might ask? Well, I noticed that a lot of political research tends to use Twitter, and there's a lot more research based on that. And I can sort of understand why, because it is a lot easier to work with the data. But I felt that Facebook was a bit neglected, which made me want to look at it. And in fact, it's much more widely used than Twitter, even before the recent sort of problems with Twitter. In the UK, it's got 55.9 million users, and it's actually the most popular social network across all age groups, and that's a 2025 figure. It's used by almost all MPs, slightly unevenly. Some have got only a few hundred followers, some have got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, but on average, they have about 27,000 followers per MP. In total, when I was doing this research, I looked at how many posts they were, all MPs together in British MPs I'm talking about, posted daily. And between them, they're posting 200 posts every single day on Facebook, generating 28,000 interactions on Facebook every day. Social media is increasingly used by citizens to find political information or to interact with politicians. And Facebook is also used by parties for political advertising. So in 2019, for example, 3.3 million euros was spent on targeted political adverts on Facebook, which suggests it's not just the users, but also the parties that consider it to be an important channel for reaching citizens. So just as I mentioned, my research was in two parts. Partly because of the lack of existing research on looking at Facebook, I didn't have much to go on in terms of sort of what content MPs were posting, and because I wanted to find typical examples to test with citizens. So I had to find that myself in the first bit of research, which is a content analysis of Facebook posts. I'll explain that a bit more in a minute. I then followed that up with an online survey. I tested 10 exemplar posts from the content analysis on around 800 citizens. Since then, I've actually also carried out some further research, which is not included in my paper. But as part of some focus group work I was doing, I also took along some Facebook posts to the focus groups to sort of explore my recommendations and see whether they were in line with how people reacted. I'll bring a couple of examples of that into at the end of the presentation. So what was I expecting to find? Well, I expected that varying types of content would produce different evaluations of competence, integrity, and authenticity, and that this in turn would affect people's judgments of trustworthiness. Based on previous research, I was expecting to see politicians using Facebook to try to communicate their real selves. So, for example, Trump's use of Twitter was seen as sort of an example of authentic communication. I was expecting to sort of see it being used as a tool for that. Based on the existing evidence and on the situation in the UK at the time when I did the research, I was expecting overall trust to be low. So the first part of the research, like I said, was to understand how MPs are actually using Facebook and what type of content they're posting. So as I mentioned, MPs are posting hundreds of posts every day. So I needed to sort of narrow that down to find a sample that I could look at in the research. I chose to focus on a cohort of MPs who were elected in 2017. That gave me a kind of group of about 60 MPs who were all operating in similar circumstances. They were experienced MPs. They already had a chance to set up a Facebook page, establish a presence on Facebook, build a following, but not to the extent that they were too well known. Because for the second stage of research, I wanted to be able to test posts on citizens without them being too influenced by other knowledge about the MP. So the fact that they were kind of established MPs but not really high profile was quite helpful. So I focused on this particular cohort. Out of the 60, 55 of them had public pages that I was able to download information from. And I collected all their posts during 2 separate weeks in February and March. One when Parliament was in session, and another second week when Parliament was in recess, because they were posting about different types of things during those 2 periods. That gave me a sample of 817 posts in total. I coded each of the posts twice. So first for the type of content they were posting, just to get a sense of what kind of topics MPs were posting about, how they were using it as a channel. And then secondly, whether I felt that the post conveyed any of the 3 trust attributes, so competence, integrity, or authenticity, and whether it seemed to be positive, neutral, or negative in relation to those attributes. So probably not surprised, the most common type of content that politicians were posting were posts that I coded as stating a political position. So this is an example on screen from MP Eddie Hughes, who's one of the ones in the sample. He's got a photo of himself. He's making a clear political statement about migration. And that was about a quarter of all posts were of that type, where they were stating a political position. So looking at the other types of content that I found, the second most common type of content was what I coded as providing useful information. It was often sharing a third-party post about a local event in the constituency, or maybe road closure or weather incident. I coded that generally as neutral in relation to trust, because it didn't normally tell you much about the MP that was posting it. And unless they added additional information about that was sort of helpful in relation to the posts we were sharing, they were quite neutral and they didn't get much engagement. The third most common category of post was an MP visiting a local place, such as like a school, a business, or a building site. And they often showed a picture of an MP with local people, they often I often coded them as being positive in terms of authenticity because they show the MP sort of being in touch with local issues and local people, and kind of communicating with people in their constituency. I'll show you an example of one of those type of posts later on. So that was about 10% of posts. And then after that, championing a local issue was about 8%, and supporting a national campaign was about 7%. So as I've already mentioned, as well as looking at the content of the posts, I also looked at whether they supported or not the 3 different trust attributes. So here I think I found the part fairly encouraging. More than 60% of the content supported at least one of the attributes, and some of them conveyed 2 or 3 attributes, which is why if you look at this graph, it adds up to more than 100% because some posts were coded to support 2 or 3 attributes. By far the most common ones were ones that I coded to demonstrate competence. So, for example, as I showed on the graph before, 7% of all posts showed an MP making a speech in Parliament, often about a local issue, and I generally coded that to be positive in relation to demonstrating competence. In terms of the different attributes, integrity was the least easy to represent, perhaps, and that is often thought of as being the most important. So that is maybe something that MPs could think about when trying to sort of improve their presence on Facebook, but perhaps it is something that's harder to convey. There was, although there's quite a lot of neutral content, there wasn't very much that I felt was actually detrimental to trust. And the only ones that I really did code as being detrimental were generally more about the style of the post rather than the actual content. So things that looked very overproduced sometimes seemed insincere, but there wasn't many things that were actively negative, which is what you would really hope. I realise at this point you're probably thinking, this is great, but this is quite subjective. It's all my own opinion of how I'm interpreting these posts, and that was totally my concern as well at this stage, which is why in the second stage of the research I then wanted to test out some sample these posts on some citizens to see whether they shared my interpretations. So I took 10 exemplar posts, so posts that were sort of typical of a particular type of content, and I also chose ones that were so half of them were male, half female, and half are Conservative and half are Labour MPs. And my sample of participants, they were all either Conservative or Labour supporters because it made me easier for me to compare the results at the end. I set up an online survey in Qualtrics. I had about 450 participants. The thing about doing it online meant I could embed the post. So rather than having to get permission from the MPs to let me use their posts, I could include a link in the survey that meant that they were embedded as if the person was just viewing them live on the Facebook page. So it meant they're really realistic. They're looking at a post as they would see it on Facebook. And so then what I asked people to do was to read the post and then to rate the MP that posted it on these, 5 different attributes. So you'll see here I split, based on my experience of coding the first set of posts, I actually split authenticity into its 2 different aspects because they seem to be sort of conveyed differently in the content. So we had competence, integrity, in touch, which is one side of authenticity, and then authentic, which is more about conveying their real self, and then finally whether they considered them to be trustworthy. I also asked people whether they, to what extent they recognised the MP or not, to check whether that was having any effect on their level of trust. I also asked some demographic questions and some general questions about trust in MPs and political leadership, and I'll cover those briefly now. So before we get into the results for the individual posts, I just wanted to sort of talk briefly about the baseline level of trust among the respondents in the survey. So the ratings in this graph, they're on a scale of -5 to +5. The blue bars are showing Conservative voters, so that's the right wing in the UK, and the orange bars are showing Labour Party voters. So there's 3 things to highlight about this. So as expected, overall trust is really low. Secondly, there were really big differences between Conservative voters, the Conservatives were in power at the time when I did the survey, and Labour voters. So you can see that among Labour voters, so that's one in orange, it's really negative. Whereas among Conservative voters, they're slightly positive, except in relation to Liz Truss. It was around the time of her disastrous premiership, so that's not totally surprising. But they're overall generally positive. And this partisan difference in the way in trust is a key feature of the data, and I will talk about a bit more later on. Then looking at the third thing to point out is that while all of the Labour voters were negative on all these points, when they came to rating individual MPs, all the ratings on average were above zero, even among Labour voters. So there's kind of some, I felt some optimism in that people can find something trustworthy about MPs, even when their baseline level of trust is really, really low. So, sorry, we're now looking at the results for the 10 MPs. I've realised this is quite a messy graph. It's quite difficult to show all in one image, but I want to try and give a sort of overview of all the results. So this graph shows the ratings for each individual post on 5 different dimensions. So competence, integrity, authenticity, which is split into authentic and in touch, and then also trust, which is shown in pink. Like I said, I did also ask about whether the MP was well known, and that generally they were not known by, they were known by a tiny amount of respondents, and that didn't have any correlation with the trust rating. So I also just to mention at this point that although I'm referring to them by the name of the MP, I should, just to be fair on the MPs, point out that the rating is just based on one single post, and really I'm rating the content in that post, not the actual MP. So I'm not suggesting here that any of these MPs are more trustworthy than others. I'm just saying that this is how they're rated based on this single post that people looked at. So 4 things to highlight about this graph. First of all, you can see that there's significant differences between different MPs, which to me suggests that the Facebook posts did affect their judgments. They didn't just go, we don't trust any MPs, they're all going to be 0. They did actually vary according to what they saw on the post. Trust, which is shown in pink, is low, although it is in the positive. It's above 0 for all the posts. The bottom one only just slightly, but the average score is shown by the diamond, with a 95% confidence interval shown by the bar. But you can see also it sort of sits below the other attributes, which suggests that the other attributes are rated in one way, and then the people's distrust of government in general maybe slightly pulled that down. And I did see that in the results. There is an overall correlation between trust and the other attributes, which suggests they are all connected. But you can also see that in some cases the ratings diverge significantly, which suggests that people were able to consider each of them separately. So they didn't just make a single global judgment. They could say, oh, well, this one does look quite authentic, but actually they don't look very competent. We can see the clearest example of that is in the post by Douglas Ross, where you can see the bars here are the most spread out. I'm just going to show you that post now to look at it a bit more closely. So this is the post in question. It was a really personal one. I picked it for that reason. It was showing his wife on Mother's Day with the kids, and they've got a croissant in the oven, and they haven't got a card, and it's very much showing his sort of true self. So I put that in for that reason, to see how people reacted to that. And interesting, it did get good engagement on Facebook. It's got a lot more likes than many of the other posts, but it didn't rate very highly for overall trustworthiness. You can see, as I sort of expected, that it's rated highest for authenticity of the different attributes, and it's rated particularly low for competence. And then the trust rating is also quite low, so it's not been really pulled up by the fact that people thought he was quite authentic. So I'm going to compare this now with the post that scored the highest overall for trustworthiness. So the highest scoring post, which is shown here on the right, was posted by Bramah, who's a Conservative MP, and he's showing himself at a neighbourhood meeting addressing crime issues. Now, I chose this post because I created it myself as an example of competence. He's shown in a suit. He's alongside some police members of the police force. He's also with constituents. He looks like he's doing something active. He's addressing an important issue of crime, and so I felt that he would be showing the attribute of competence. And you can see that from the graph. So this graph is showing in red the ratings for Bramah and his post, and then in blue the ratings for the previous post by Douglas Ross. So you can see that as expected, he does score highly on competence. But what I think is interesting, and why I'm showing it to you really, is that despite the fact it's very much a professional photo, he's in his work, he's clearly at work here. He's not revealing anything about his interests or his life or his family or anything. It rates just as highly, or if not more highly, for authenticity, as in showing his real self, as the post by Douglas Ross in the previous example. And yet, unlike the Douglas Ross post, it rates really high for all the other attributes as well. So I suppose it's this is showing that um, being showing your real self is not necessarily a successful strategy for showing yourself to be trustworthy and competent, and actually showing. I think perhaps one reason why it is also seen as authentic is that although he's not revealing himself in a personal setting, it looks quite amateur. The photos look quite real. That he maybe his assistant's taken on something, but they're not professionally staged. They're showing something in action, which perhaps helps to show that it's a real photo and not something that's been set up. Also, he's listening to his constituents, so that helps to demonstrate integrity, that he's in touch with them and he's paying attention to them. So I think this is an example. This is the one that was rated highest for trust, and this is an example of a good type of Facebook post that politicians could possibly use as a model. So one more example to share from the survey, and this is to illustrate the effects of partisanship. So this is a post by Marsha de Cordova, who's a Labour MP, and she's posting about her support for some P&O ferries workers who were fired. One thing to note is, although she's a Labour MP, it doesn't actually say there's nothing in the picture or in her sort of Facebook name to tell you that she's a Labour MP. And I found that was the case in many of the Facebook profiles. That I might have expected that to be more obvious, like a sort of a red colour in the background or something in the name. And so in some cases, it wasn't actually that obvious what party they were from, and that perhaps is a positive, sort of conscious strategy on behalf of their MPs, because maybe it makes them appeal to their whole constituency rather than just people that voted for them. But then, obviously, when you look at the text, it is obvious that she's from the opposition. She criticises the Conservative parties for not acting, and she's standing up for the workers' rights, which is a typical Labour position. And then you can see that there's a really significant difference between how she was rated by Conservative and Labour Party supporters. So what's interesting, I think, about this is that the general shape of the ratings is the same. So it seems like they interpreted the post in the same way, but then the kind of level of trust was just kind of moved by their partisan position. So Conservative voters were much less trusting of her, even though they sort of acknowledged that she was showing perhaps that she was in touch a little bit by this post. Labour Party's supporters had the same interpretation, but they rated her more highly for trust. And I mean, I saw this on several other posts where there was a clear political position in the post, but this was the most obvious example. So the other as well as partisanship, I looked at some other factors that might have influenced people's trust rating beyond just the content of the post. I found that people's age had no significant effect on how they evaluated the different posts. Gender did have an effect. I found that people who identified as female were much more positive than respondents who identified as male, so they were significantly more generous in their ratings. Education also had an effect, but only on the attribute that I called in touch. So people who'd been to university were more likely to say that politicians were in touch. And that's perhaps because MPs are more likely to be graduates. And therefore people who are also graduates themselves may feel they have more in common with MPs, but I can't be sure about that, but that's a possible explanation for that anomaly. Overall, the people's analysis was broadly in line with my assessments, with a few exceptions. One of the places where my predictions were slightly wrong was that sometimes when people rated a post positively, they then rated all the attributes positively, even if they weren't that clearly demonstrated. So this post, for example, by MP Vicky Ford, she's visiting a tower in the constituency to look at some fire safety work. I put this in as an example of being in touch because I felt that she's showing that she's understanding the needs of constituents. She's out there with someone in her community, finding out what's going on. But people also rated this highly for competence and integrity, suggesting maybe there's an element of making a global judgment of her based on one positive attribute, or perhaps they felt that by looking at this, she was showing herself to be competent. We can't know for sure. But so I wasn't 100% accurate, but I was. It was pretty good. So to conclude, both studies suggest that Facebook could have a positive role in helping to rebuild trust. The second study suggests that posts that convey competence, integrity, and authenticity are likely to improve perception of trustworthiness. And I have started to be able to identify what types of content can help with this. I'm going to give you some more specific examples in a minute. So, as I said in the beginning, a quarter of posts that MPs are posting are stating a political position. And it's interesting to note from these results that partisanship has a big role to play in the way people interpret those posts. So those sort of posts will be likely to be interpreted quite positively by people who share that political position, but by people who don't, they might have a more negative view of them. So for MPs that are trying, it really depends on the audience of the Facebook page. If the MP really feels that they're just speaking to their own supporters, then political posts are probably going to have quite a good reception. But if they're trying to reach their whole constituency, posts that are really political might be interpreted differently. And I'm not suggesting that MPs shouldn't post about politics, because obviously that's what they're there to do. But there is something about the style of them. So the one that had the biggest partisan difference that I showed by Marsha de Cordoba, in that case, she was not only stating position, but she's also criticising the opposition party, which probably made it even more negative to the support of that party. So there's probably something about the choice of language that can kind of minimise that effect. On the positive side, so partisanship is a big factor, but positive side is that even people with really low general trust were able to imagine that individual politicians could be trustworthy. People were able to find positives by looking at the posts. The third most popular type of content that I found in the first survey, so visiting a local place or acting on a local issue, they were regarded positively by the participants in the survey. So that sort of suggests that MPs are going down the right route by posting that sort of content. Finally, because social media has been described in other research as a channel for performed authenticity, I was expecting to see quite a lot of personal content. And in fact, in the first survey, it was really quite uncommon. It was probably about only 1% of all the content posted. So MPs aren't really posting that much personal content. And then when I tested it but I included it in the second survey because of this fact that it's been talked about in the literature. And like we saw with the example from Douglas Ross, is not all that helpful when it comes to rebuilding trust either. So this example I've got here is another one that I saw. I held some focus groups recently, and I took along some examples of posts to try and sort of test out and explore a bit more about the recommendations I made in this paper and see how people react to them. And I took along this post as a more recent example of a personal post that an MP had put on Facebook recently to see what the Facebook focus group participants made of it. And in common with the survey, people didn't really land well. People were like, what is she posting about? She's just trying to be normal. People said, oh, it's in the post, it says, oh, when I finish reading the book, I'll take it along to charity shops so other people can enjoy it. People said, oh, that's sickening. I don't believe she's really going to do that. She's just trying to make herself sound nice. Two different participants in different focus groups said, how does she even have time to read books? She's supposed to be an MP. People were really negative about it. There's like maybe a couple of participants said, oh yeah, no, she seems more normal by this. So there was a small percentage who sort of could see a positive out of this, but overwhelmingly there's negative reception to this kind of post. The other sort of thing that was uncommon, as well as these personal posts, I found very little evidence of MPs using Facebook as a tool for two-way communication. So most of the posts were much more, they weren't really asking for views, they were just sort of broadcasting as if in more style of traditional media. And I felt that perhaps a more two-way use of Facebook might be helpful in rebuilding trust. There were some small examples of MPs doing it, but they were quite a small portion. Also, there was very, very rare examples of MPs talking about challenges or mistakes they'd made, and that kind of honesty that's difficult to do as an MP, but might have been helpful. So now now my list of do's and don'ts based um, on this on this research. So I should bring this with a bit of a caveat that it is based on a small sample of posts. So there might be other great examples of content that are really helpful in rebuilding trust that I've not tested. For example, I couldn't include video in my survey, so I haven't tested whether that helps or not. But these do come from testing posts on around 800 people, and I've also tested some of these recommendations in the focus groups too. So I've got quite a lot of confidence in these suggestions. I'm not going to read it all out because you can see it on the screen. But these are some of the things that were positive, some features of the positive posts and the negative posts. I suppose the key things to bear in mind for MPs or for communications teams who are producing content is that the audience is quite sophisticated. Facebook's been around for almost 20 years now, so people are familiar with the format and they can spot generic posts or posts that look like posts that have been clearly supplied by a communications team, or they've been choreographed photo opportunities. People can spot that they're not authentic, and so they don't really work. And also people are quite cynical, like we saw earlier on. Obviously, people have got starting from a point of low trust, so they're looking through quite a negative lens to start with. So they're the for example, when MPs are showing support for a charity or a local issue, they need to show that they're actually engaging with it and taking action on a topic. If it just looks like a sort of PR opportunity where they just come along for 5 minutes and taking a picture, people are going to be suspicious, and that's what people told me in the focus groups. The other thing that I suppose the limitation of the survey is that it only showed one post in isolation, and in reality, you'd see, if you're following an MP on Facebook, you'd see sort of over time a number of different posts from them, one after another. And people in the focus groups told me that it's really important that MPs are consistent over time. So sticking to a consistent message, for example, if they're talking about a local issue, to be showing how they're following up on it and what they've done next and how they listen to people, or and also a consistent style of content. So going back to the book example, people said, well, if she's like really into reading and she's always posting this kind of books, then maybe it might seem more authentic. But if it's just a one-off post, it just seems really random and kind of out of place. So a consistency of message and style could help to improve credibility. And then finally, that like I suggested in the conclusions, that two-way communication rather than just using Facebook in broadcast mode could help to improve trust. And this is something I also tested in my focus group research. So this is an example of a post from Lee Rowley MP, who's organising a Facebook Live session on Facebook, and is supposed to promote it. So I took this along to the focus group to see how they reacted to this as an idea of using Facebook for two-way communication. And this did really land well with the respondents. So even people who are really, really negative and distrusting of pretty much all MPs went, oh, actually, yeah, that's quite good. That's quite brave of him to do that. I like the fact he's trying to listen to people, and he's not just doing it once, he's doing it regularly. He says, I'm doing it again this Sunday. Oh yeah, I would go to that, or I like the fact he's doing that. And so I think that this is something that the MPs could, it's not easy to do, but it's something they could consider in efforts to rebuild trust. So I mean, it's a super interesting topic. There's so much potential for research. There's so much more to do, really. But that sort of concludes my work so far. Just before I close, I just thought I'd mention how I'm taking my research forward. I've got two other papers in progress. One piece of work is a focus group study, like I mentioned, and actually it's not mainly about Facebook. It's mainly looking at the thought processes of citizens. So I'm trying to understand more about when they're making trust judgments, how they go about it. And then my other piece of work is a survey experiment looking at whether independent regulation of pay and expenses can help to improve trust. That's still a work in progress, but so far my finding is that just mentioning pay and expenses has a negative effect on trust. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you have any questions, I'd really be happy to answer them. Thanks.
Thank you, Helen. Very interesting presentation. Are there any immediate questions from the audience? Okay, we can see. Okay. Aneta Villagi, thank you very much for the interesting presentation article. She has two questions. Your research highlights the impact of social media content on perceptions of political trustworthiness. Given the increasing role of artificial intelligence content and deepfake technology, how do you see future challenges in maintaining authenticity and trust in online political communications? First. Second, your findings suggest that Facebook posts emphasizing competence and integrity can enhance perceptions of political trustworthiness. Were there any significant differences in how different demographic groups, e.g. age, political affiliation, responded to this trust attribute, apart from in-touch attribute, which negatively correlates with higher education? And what implication might this have for political communication strategies? Thank you. That's the first question.
Thank you for the questions. Yeah, I mean, on the first question, absolutely, it's a massive problem. I mean, I think you have to give some sort of credibility to the users of Facebook, that people are actually quite switched on to the content they're looking at, and they can to some extent recognize when at the moment you can still sometimes recognize when things are done by AI, but I totally appreciate that it's going to become increasingly difficult as it gets better and better. And I think that it is just going to be an increasing challenge. I think that again it highlights the importance of two-way communication, showing that it's a real person. I think that the style that people post in does really make a difference, like actually being more amateurish and less sort of highly produced content, which is probably more like the sort of thing you might get from AI, can be helpful. But yeah, it is going to be a challenge. I haven't got a short answer for your question, but I totally agree. In answer to the second question, I'm sorry, I don't have that information on me at the moment. I'm pretty sure that I have looked at it, but I don't have the figures right in front of me, but I can come back to you with it.
Thank you. Is this study differentiating posts which are written by the MPs themselves and their communication teams, or you cannot identify these different creations either by the MP, him or herself, or by his PR team? Maybe it's difficult to find out who wrote it. But do you separate official Facebook team posts compared to this Mother Day post where one MP is making a photograph of his family?
Yeah, so I think you can't really tell. I mean, myself, I've worked in communications for quite a long time, and it's the sort of thing that I probably would have done. It's to write a fake post, or not a fake post, write a post on behalf of someone else. So if the person writing is really good, you shouldn't probably be able to tell. But the one so I just by looking at them, you can't necessarily, if it's just a written post, you can't necessarily tell. And people are aware of that. I mean, in the focus groups, some people did start saying, "Oh, probably haven't even written this themselves." The one thing that I can share, I'm just going to share my screen again if this works.
Yes, you can.
Does that work?
Not yet.
Oh, hang on. No, hold on a sec.
No, it's coming. It's coming.
You've got that. So this one was the post that. So if you remember on the trust graph, there was one post that was right down at the bottom on only just being scoring sort of just above 0 for trust. And now this one is clearly being provided by a communications team or by the Labour Party communications team, and the MPs just sharing it. And this one was rated really low because in this case he's not actually added anything to himself. He's just literally just shared someone else's content, and the content itself, it's just, I mean, it seems a bit unusual coming from political parties to get involved in something like Mother's Day. I think people may be thinking, why are they doing that? And it scored really low for all of the different attributes, this sort of thing. And I mean, one reason for including it was to think, well, if you're part of a communications team for a political party and you're producing this sort of content, maybe you're not actually, it's not actually being that helpful in terms of trust. If the had made a personal comment with it, maybe, but just on its own, it was definitely interpreted negatively.
Thank you. I have some questions myself. There seems to be that if the posts are about private life, they are less supporting trust than posts about the job of politician. If the politician goes somewhere, meeting people and so on, he seems to be more trustworthy than pictures of his family at the swimming pool. So there seems to be some private public, which is understandable because they don't want family fathers or mothers, they want politicians watching them what they're doing. Secondly, there seems to be an amateurish professional tension. If there's a slight touch of amateur design, this seems to be preferable to super elegant polishing by professional teams, so sleek and perfect image. So there seems to be the impression that if it's a little bit amateurish, people trust them more than having this super polished television video performance. And finally, there was one very high trustworthy event where this Afulami MP, he is presenting together with the police. We know the police has a very high trust, so maybe the trust of the police is sort of bringing some light for the politician. So if I'm an MP and I'm next to a policeman, maybe my rating is better because people say, he's working with the police, and I trust the police much more than politicians. So there might be some echo effect, I would say.
I think so, but I think that, like I said earlier, I think people are quite intelligent, and when they're looking at them, if I think that effect only works, I think it worked well in the example that I gave because he was actually working with them. He wasn't just sort of in a photo call. He was actually actively at a meeting where they were alongside each other and they were doing something. Whereas and the same thing about the sort of professional amateur point, that when people are kind of they're coming to it quite cynically, and if they see like a very professional photo where someone's just for example, again in the focus group, I took an example, I'll probably show it to you, of an MP, a kind of what looks like a photo call where they're alongside a charity and they're all kind of with some kids and stuff. People were kind of immediately negative about that because they thought, it's just a publicity stunt. He's not really doing anything. So I think that just people sort of just do know how PR works to some extent, and they're kind of cynical about it. So they have to sort of show something real that's going on in the post. And I think people kind of like allow, because there might be you might have thought that a more professional post would show them to be more competent because they'd be more using social media in a more sort of like advanced way. But I think that people recognize that the nature of the medium is that it is quite people do it quickly and kind of on the fly, and that it doesn't necessarily have to be top quality photos. It's more like it's got to be real photos.
Yeah. Thank you. The leader of the Swedish team, Professor Puranen, you want to ask? Should I read it out or you want to ask the question yourself?
I'm reading it.
Yeah, well, Christian, you can read it out. Actually, it's about both the distrustful ones. I mean, we get really interested in these people, especially nowadays with what is happening on the other side of the Atlantic. And the second one is about the group In Touch. If you compare the attributes that you use, competence, integrity, and authenticity, and you divide it into the one In Touch and the others, what findings do you find?
Thank you.
So I think I've got it on the slide. I'm just seeing if I can find it.
Take your time.
Yes.
It's always trustworthy to be a little bit amateurish or slow, but you're very professional. It's very impressive.
Oh yeah, here we go.
Yes.
I'm just going to share this. I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're asking, but let me see. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes, we can
So,
see it.
this is a linear regression model showing how the attribute scores and some of the different variables related to the sort of global judgment for trustworthiness. So you can't. There isn't a great the competence integrity scores. You can see a lot more have a much greater impact than in touch and authenticity, and they don't really they don't differ too much on this. I think I'm not sure if I'm answering if this is what you're asking.
Yeah, this is exactly what I asked for. Thanks a lot. This is really, yeah, exactly. To see the in touch versus the others when it comes to competence, integrity, and authenticity. Yes, this is interesting. And I believe also that what happens if you do when you run the same regression with the distrustful ones, if you separate distrustful ones from the rest.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that's something that I haven't done, but it's a really good idea. I haven't tried that, but I could do so. Taking out like would you say like the bottom half or the bottom like quarter, let's say, of distrustful ones, and see how they look as a group.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good idea.
I think that would be interesting to do, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And also thinking about what's happening on the other side of the Atlantic, that could be really interesting. Who are the distrustful ones? Nowadays, it looks like the distrustful ones are the opposite. I mean, it seems like it's changing. And of course, it's time dependent. I mean, from when you did this catching and what is happening now. And it would be extremely interesting to do this, to repeat this with the situation we have now, because things around trust and trustworthiness are certainly changing a lot right now.
I agree. And I was conscious actually that even, I mean, sort of kind of leading on from the person that asked a question about AI as well. I mean, even the social media is changing so rapidly in the way, I mean, even Facebook as a platform, like when I did this, I mean, I don't know, like now, if you go onto Facebook and you look on a Facebook feed, the amount of content you get that's just adverts or stuff that you've not followed is massive. So the chance of people, the percentage of content you get of stuff you've actually chosen is much, much less. So the probability of people actually finding content from their local MP on Facebook is probably reduced since I did this, because before you used to get a lot more relevant content than you do now. And then also people, well, Facebook's still the most highly used channel, but yeah, people are changing how they use it, and I don't. Also, there has been a change of government since I did this, so I think that it is always changing. It's hard to keep up, isn't it? It's always changing field, but some of the general principles I think probably still remain the same. I mean, I was interested. I was sort of interested in the in touch authenticity, the difference between the two attributes, because I felt there was something in there, but I didn't find anything conclusive about what that meant, other than the authenticity on its own didn't particularly prove to be that helpful. And again, what you say about this, what's going on in the States, I don't know. Also, the style of politics is different. Whether that would affect how this sort of stuff's interpreted, and maybe people will kind of, it's even more personality led in the States, and perhaps in that sense, authenticity becomes more important. I'm not sure.
The next question is, sorry.
Just a short comment, Christian, if I may. It would be really interesting to look at authenticity, as you point out, in the concept of what is happening now. I also would like to add that I really like that you chosen Facebook, because there are so many more people. If you look, I mean, one thing if you look at X or Twitter, but Facebook has another profile, And that profile is extremely valuable when we talk about trust and trustworthiness. So thank you for doing that. Thanks.
I can see why people don't do it, because the difficulty, as you can see from my work, is that there's so many variables that it's very hard to, in terms of trying to see what's causing what. There's a million different things that you can control. But I think in terms of being something that people are actually using, I think it's worth looking at. So I know there's other people wanting to.
Yes. The next question is by Aneta Vilagi.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation. I finally got the chance to speak up. So I basically, my questions were already asked and answered as first questions, but I would like to also share our findings from the research we done within the TrueDem project working package number 6, where we actually studied 34 different politicians from 12 project countries, and we follow up Facebook profiles and also comments to those profiles. And I just want to confirm some of your findings, that we also found out that basically the most or majority of those posts that frame one of the attributes of trustworthiness, majority of them frame competence as something that is probably very important for the politicians. And also I would like to stress one of your findings, that despite the fact that Facebook actually allows two-way communication, it's used very, very rarely. In our research, for politician to respond, for example, on comment made by a citizen or follower in Facebook, it really happens only occasionally, like in very small percentage of what was actually studied as comments. So I just wanted to say this, that it was very interesting to read your paper, and we basically follow a very similar topics, research topics. So I will be glad to meet you at the ECPR conference and speak about our findings and compare them with yours.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's really great to hear. And I'm looking forward to, I haven't seen your work, but I will definitely look it up now. And the point about two-way communication, I do recognise that it's a quite hard thing for politicians to do, because they're kind of worried about people piling on it. It can be a mistake in terms of engaging in comments and stuff. From my PR hat on, it's sometimes we just avoid it. But there are other ways that politicians could do it, I think. I mean, I think people, for example, they could do polls, or they could do slightly more controlled methods of gaining feedback that wasn't necessarily just opening up like a whole discussion online, but they could still there's lots of other options for actively gaining feedback that are not just on comments that are out there. And when Facebook was first, when social media first came along, everyone said, oh, it's so great, it's going to revolutionize communication because it's got this two-way capability. And it's just not. People are just sort of, I think lots of people just see it as a replacement for the local paper, and they're just going to use it as if it's like an online press release. So it's a bit of a missed opportunity.
Thank you. The next question is from the team leader from Ukraine, Professor Kuzina, Irina.
I'll try to be short. First of all, I want to thank you so much. It's really interesting, so interesting research, so interesting results. I have one small question. It's probably even a little bit technical. It was about slide when you started to say about your online survey, when you asked 400 people and gave them 10 exemplar posts just to evaluate on those attributes that you have previously discovered. And I was wondering, have you ever tried to compare these attributes in terms of some variance, standard deviation, interquartile range? Were people close to the mean value when speaking about this attribute, or it was spread? So were people in one point when saying this, yes, here there is trust and there's competence? Or it was just so subjective, and this variance was too big.
Yeah,
What did you understand?
I think I'm gonna understand. So what you're saying is like, to what extent do people agree on the ratings? Were they like,
Yeah.
were they clustering around like sort of quite small, or were they really, really spread out?
Yeah.
I think I haven't got that in this slide deck, but I have I'm sorry, I haven't got that off the top of my head, but it's a good question, and I'll come. I'll look it up when I'm off the call. Thank you. I think I have looked at it, but I haven't got it off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. One thing is interesting. You said politicians on their profile, if the party label is not on their profile, so it's about this person, but not Labour and Conservative, then people trust them a bit more. So they're sort of hiding the label. Of course, people know who they are, but basically, if they don't show the party label on their first profiles page, maybe this is increasing their trust level.
I don't know for sure, because I can only sort of speculate about what I found, but I was just quite surprised, because when I did the first exercise, when I was rating them, I sort of assumed it would be quite obvious from even from like the little, when I clicked on people's pages, and I thought it would be in their little bio, what,
Yeah.
and I was quite surprised that it wasn't always that obvious. And even when I went into the page, sometimes I actually had to look them up to find out. And I did see that in one of the I didn't show an example of it in the presentation, but there was one MP who I put in as a Conservative MP because I tried to balance the number. But his post was actually about something there was nothing on his picture and his name just say that he was a Conservative MP. And he posted about something about renters' rights, which is much more of a typical Labour Party issue. And actually, when I looked at his ratings, he had a sort of similar pattern to we saw with Marshall de Cordova, that he was preferred by Labour voters quite significantly, even though he was actually a Conservative politician, because you just couldn't tell he was Conservative, and because the policy position he was taking was actually more in line with Labour. So what I don't know, I can't say whether that was a deliberate strategy on his part, but I do know from my focus group research that people actually really like parties cooperating and working together, and they don't really like sort of criticizing each other, and they want them to sort of work together and be constructive rather than criticizing each other. So I can be quite confident in saying that at least sort of not attacking other parties is probably a good strategy.
Yeah, thank you. Because we have the same in Austria and Germany, more and more national politicians, regional politicians, and local, they hide the name of their party on the posters. So they are saying, I'm so and so, but at some point, but even they try to hide the name of the party, and it seems to work.
Yeah. Which is a bad sign about the parties, really. But a lot of people aren't in parties anymore, are they? So they want to feel that the politician's working for the local area, not for the party.
Exactly. Okay, we are at the end of our time. Are there any other final comments, questions to today's speaker? It rang a lot of bells for us because we talk non-stop about trustworthiness. So we are happy to meet researchers who have the same hot topic like us, the club of people who study trustworthiness. And many of us, I think, are at the ECPR conference in Greece. So maybe we can have a meeting there, informal meeting of the trust people, which we are trusting a lot. Okay. Do you want to say something, Helen, in conclusion?
I just wanted to say thanks very much for everyone for coming along and for your really interesting questions. And it's been a real pleasure to meet you and to present my research, and I've really enjoyed it. So, and I really hope to meet you in Greece if you're there, and come and say hi. And it'd be good to stay in touch.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your wonderful questions. Of course, for your excellent presentation. And good luck with your future research. And keep us posted about your progress, please.
Thanks.
Thank you. And take care.
You.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.